What's up guys, there's Cousin here and welcome to my React tutorial. In this one, we're going to take a look at two very important hooks in React, useState and useEffect. We're going to explain both of them very clearly and very simply, and by the end of this video, you'll have everything you need to know to start using them in your projects. So let's get to it. Alright guys, welcome to the useState and useEffect Simply Explained tutorial. I have here a demo app which is built using Create React App, so it's nothing too fancy. You should be very familiar. It's for demo purposes. We have the code here of the project, and let's start using useState and useEffect. We're going to start with useState. What is useState and why do you use it? Well, if you know in React, you can have state in your class components. You can construct the components with state, and then you can use that state to display information inside of the render function, and you can manipulate the state with certain functions. You use this .setState. The problem was that you couldn't do this with a functional component. A functional component such as this, const app, you could never have state until React hooks, until React 16.8. And this is where useState and useEffect came into play. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use this function. We're going to demo how useState works, how you can put state inside of your functional components. So the first thing we want to do is we want to import useState from React. Now the syntax for this is, first you want to import React as you usually do for any component, and then you want to do comma, and then a named import useState. And when I save, it's going to auto format. This is where you get useState from React. Then what you want to do is, let's think about the best way to illustrate this. I'm going to use a counter example because that is very simple, it's very straightforward, and it's the best way for you to understand how to display the state, how to update the state. We're going to increment the counter and decrement the counter. So first, let's remove all of this stuff that we don't actually need, and let's create our counter variables. So in useState, first you want to declare a constant, so const, and then you want to open a tuple, and you want to do the first element of the tuple is always going to be your state variable. So in our case, it's going to be count. This is how we're going to use this variable inside of our return function to actually display the count number. And then you want to do comma, and the second element is going to be the function that manipulates the count. So in our case, we're going to call it setCount. Now you don't have to write them like this. You can have these variables be named whatever you want. By convention, it's a lot easier to have just your variable name defined here, and then you have set variable name, whatever that is, as your function. That is just good practice to do. If I was to recommend it, you should always do this. It keeps it very simple, very clean. And then what we want to do is we want to do equals useState, and then open parentheses, and here we want to give a default value to our count variable. So this variable should, when the component first renders, it should render with a default value. So in our case, we're going to give it 0. And we're going to do this. So now this is perfect. We have our component. We have our state. What we're going to then do is display it inside of our component by doing count and saving it here. Now the advantage of doing it this way is you no longer have to do this .count, right? This .state.count, sorry, for class components. You can directly do count. If your applications start to get really big with a lot of components, a lot of moving parts, this will come in very handy. It'll make it just a little bit cleaner. Now if you switch over to our app, we should see that our count is now 0. Perfect. So now we have state inside of our application. Let's now start manipulating state. Let's increment this counter by 1. To do that, I'm going to do a very simple button with an onclick function that will do onclick. Do it this syntax, set count plus 1. Close the button and then do increment. You could do it this way. Of course, you can also create your own function that is const increment, and then you would do set count plus 1. And then pass, instead of this, pass the functional reference to increment like this. You could do it either way. We'll do it the first way. I like it better. And now if we refresh, we'll have a button that when we click this button, it'll set the count to count plus 1. Count here being 0, plus 1 being 1. So every time I click it, it will increase the count by 1. Perfect. So now we have manipulation of state. That's very good. Now, if I want to do another button, by the way, if you're wondering what I'm using Vim, the Vim plugin. I usually always use Vim. It allows me to be a lot faster in my code. If you want to go for it, check it out. Now, instead of set count plus 1, here we're going to do count minus 1 and then decrement. Refresh, we'll have two buttons, increment, decrement, increment, decrement. Perfect. This is how useState works. Now you have stateful components inside of functional components. That is very great. So let's say that instead of having the state start at 0, let's say that we want to pretend that we are calling an API. We're not actually going to call an API, but the response of that API should increment the count by 1, and we want this to do when the component mounts. If you've used class components before, then you know of componentDidMount. Well, useEffect is a replacement for componentDidMount, and the great thing is it does componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate, and componentWillUnmount in one single function, and that is beautiful. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import useEffect from React. We will remove these two buttons for now because we don't need them. We just want the count. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to do, let's make more space here just so to keep it clean. useEffect. We're going to open the function, open an arrow function. And then here we're going to do set count plus 1. And then we'll put the brackets there. So what this is going to do, this acts as componentDidMount and componentDidUpdate and componentDidUnmount all at once. What this is going to do, and I'm going to show you that we're missing something here, but this is going to set the count every time this component renders. So when this component mounts, when this component updates. If I press save and look at it, it's constantly increasing the count, which is not something that we want. We wanted to do it just once because we're trying to emulate componentDidMount. So first of all, let's comment this out, save it, so we don't do anything to our count. It resets to 0. What you want to do is, let's uncomment it now before saving. useEffect always takes in an array of dependencies right here. This will tell useEffect to only run when something in this array of dependencies changes. So if I was to put count, this useEffect will only run if count changes. If I save it, what do you think is going to happen? The same thing happens here again. The reason being is that we're setting the count first. The count is now count plus 1. This count is being updated, which means that this count is updated because it's the same variable, which is going to cause this useEffect to keep on re-rendering. We don't want this. Instead, what we want to do is just pass an empty array of dependencies. This means that useEffect has nothing to change. Nothing will ever change in this component, so useEffect will only run once. What we should now see is the count should no longer be 0, it should be 1. And you see here we now have 1. So that is how useEffect works for componentDidMount. Now we've seen that if you were to put count here, we will get something like componentDidUpdate, right, which runs every time this component updates. But we don't want to put count. What we could do is we could do const second count and then set second count equals useState, and in this one what we'll do is we'll use 1 just so that we know that it's different. And here what we want to do is we want to add a button again, button onclick. We want this to set the second count, so set second count plus 1. Close the button, increment second. Then here we want to display our, we're going to put a dash so we have some visual separation. Second count, I misspelled it. Second count, we want to, and then before saving, instead of passing count here, we want to pass second count. Now if we save, what this is going to do, this useEffect will only run when second count is updated, which is great because we can update second count here. The only time when second count is going to be updated is when we click this button. It doesn't care about count, but when second count is updated, it's going to change the initial count. But the initial count changing will not cause this useEffect to re-render, to rerun, because it's not in one of the array dependencies. So let's see what this is going to do. we have 1, 1. So when I increment second, what's gonna happen is it will increment our second count, which is this one, by 1. And actually, let's use this. Let's put 5. So we know our first count is going to be 6, and our second count is going to be 1. 6 because 5, and then plus 1 because this runs on componentDidMount. So 6, 1. What's going to end up happening now, I'm going to click this. This will increase to 2, and then it will cause the second count to be updated, which will cause the useEffect to be run, which will set the initial count to plus 1. So that means 7. So I do this, we'll have 7 and 2. I increase it, we'll have 8 and 3, 9 and 4, 10 and 5, and so on. That is how you could control this useEffect to only run on the instances and the times that you want it to run. Okay, and now the last part, let's use useEffect to actually run something on componentWillUnmount, which is also something very useful. So what I'm going to do is I am going to remove this useEffect here. I'm going to remove it from the top dependencies because we don't need it. I am going to remove this second count. I'm going to remove this count. I'm going to remove this. And what we'll do here is we want to create a component and unmount a component at will. So we need a different component. Luckily, I have this test component here, which we will be using. It's actually called other component, but that is totally fine. I can rename this file just so it's consistent. So we have this other component. What we'll do is we will import other component from other component, and then we will render it here. And then instead of, we want to create, first of all, let's just not provide an onclick to this button, and let's just do hide component. Let's see what pops up. So we have hide component and other component. If we do this, this of course does nothing. So we have to provide an onclick handler for this function. So we'll create a piece of state, const show component, and then set show component, use state. Instead of 0, now we're going to say true, because we want our component to initially be shown, to initially be rendered. And then what we want to do is we're going to replace this with show component and our component, and save this. So this component, if you don't know JavaScript notation, this means when show component is true, and this will always be true, when both of these are true, then render these. So it's going to render the other component. If show component is false, this will equate to false, so nothing will be rendered. This is good because now when we click hide component, we can add an onclick function that will do set show component false. So when we click this, we will hide this component. So let's test it out. Hide component, component is gone. Right? It disappears. Let's add, just for good measure, let's add a button that will show the component. So here we'll say true. And then instead of hide component, we'll do show component. We'll do this, and now show component will always show it, hide will hide it, show, hide, show, hide. Great. Now the only thing we need to do is we need to use useEffect on this component to do something when it unmounts. So we'll go to the other component, we will import useEffect from React, and we'll create a useEffect, like this, arrow function. And then first of all, we'll do component console componentDidMount, and we'll pass in an empty array of dependencies, so we know that this will only run when component mounts. And then let's do this. Let's go back to our browser. Let's open the developer console. You see here already componentDidMount because the component did mounted. If I was to hide it and show it again, componentDidMount again. Hide it, show it again, componentDidMount again. Cool. So now we know that this works. In useEffect, how you do unmount is you just return a function. So we'll just return a function, arrow function, and then console log component will unmount. Perfect. Now if we check this again, show component, componentDidMount, hide component, componentWillUnmount, show component mount, unmount, mount, unmount. You have componentDidMount, componentDidUpdate, and componentWillUnmount, all of this functionality in one useEffect function. Now this is great, and this is why React hooks are the future. We no longer have to use class components. We can now use functional components, and things are a lot better. They're a lot cleaner. We can organize code a lot better. And this, in my opinion, is a very efficient way of managing your local component state. So guys, this was the tutorial on how to use useState and how to use useEffect. I hope that it was very useful for you. What I recommend you now do is you open up a project, you start playing around with them, you read the documentation, because there's some specifics and some things that you want to learn about when you're using React hooks. Make sure to do that and play around with it and just get a feel for how this all works, and try building some components on your own until you feel very comfortable to implement this in some of your projects, in some of your work, in whatever you use React for. So thank you guys so much for watching. My name has been Darius Cause, and if you like these types of videos, please make sure to subscribe down below, because I will be making a lot of these React tutorials. My name has been Darius Cause. Thank you so much once again for watching, and I will see you all in the next tutorial. Ciao.